Hey all, Uranium here. In the previous episode I showcased the logistics for all the raw materials needed for a maxed nuclear plant. I then optimistically said that finishing said plant might take up to a month. Well, 3 months later I'm finally ready with all the production chains of the plant and can practically start it. This video will discuss the production details, and the next video in this series will finally show me starting up this beast. This episode might go into technical details, especially with some of the load balancers, so consider yourself warned. As mentioned in the previous episode, the idea of the plant was to create a building that resembles a massive radiation warning symbol, which practically means a circular building with 6 sectors. But I didn't want to completely fill the building with production machines, so I decided to focus fully on the production only on the first floor. The subsequent floors have one of the 6 sectors empty, providing a nice open area for the entrance hall that will be decorated later. All of the floors in the plant also have a 2 walls tall service level between them, and all the logistics will happen either in the central circle, the walls between the sectors, or the service level. This keeps the factory floor clean of the logistics. Only pipes are allowed there, as feeding fluids from below can cause problems. Let's take a look at the first floor then. Most of the basic production and even some of the more advanced items are produced here. I turn copper, iron and caterium to ingots using the pure recipes. This requires about 360 refineries. Some of the copper is turned to copper sheets in 72 refineries using the steamed copper sheet recipe. But a much larger part of it is sent together with the caterium ingot to produce quick wire using the fused quick wire recipe. The plant needs a whopping 15,660 quick-wire per minute, so the quick-wire production takes up an entire sector and 174 assemblers. Small amounts of copper is also needed elsewhere, as the plant also needs a bit of wire and alkyd aluminium sheets, but I'll talk about aluminium later. Iron ingots and coal are turned to steel ingots in 42 foundries using the solid steel ingot recipe. The steel ingots are further turned to steel beams and steel pipes. The plant also needs concrete, which is made from limestone and water with the wet concrete recipe. The plot might be clear by now. This plant uses a lot of alternate recipes, mostly to minimize the amount of resources needed to transport to the site. Silica and quartz crystal are produced using the standard recipes though, but that's simply because there are no alternate recipes available for them. The plastic and rubber needs are met by building a rubber plastic loop that I've made an entire video about, so I will not discuss it too much here. The output of these refineries is 1080 rubber per minute and 600 plastic per minute. Some of this output is naturally fed back to the loop. The oil refinement also needs to produce some petroleum coke, since that is needed for aluminium production. And talking about aluminium, each production line actually takes quite a small footprint in the plant, especially when compared to some of the massive machine requirements, looking at few copper ingots. I'm first turning bauxite and water to alumina solution with the sloppy alumina recipe. I then turn that and some petroleum coke to aluminium scrap and water with the electrode aluminium scrap recipe. The water is directed out of the plant together with some further wastewater from higher floors, turned to fuel with diluted fuel recipe and then burned. I like to avoid creating issues with liquids by directing output liquids out of the system, instead of trying to use them in the production. Finally, the aluminium scrap is turned to aluminium ingots with the pure aluminium ingot recipe. The aluminium ingot is then turned to aluminium casings and alkyd aluminium sheets. The latter requires also some copper ingots to produce. There's almost a full sector of the first floor left, and when planning this plant I realized that I can't waste any more space or the building will be very tall. So I'm manufacturing AI limiters in 64 assemblers from copper sheets and quick wire. I'm also making stators in 49 assemblers from steel pipes and quick wires using the quick wire stator recipe. Finally, I'm turning the newly created stators and AI limiters to electromagnetic control rods in 65 assemblers. So that's a lot of machines, and this is just the first floor. However, this is the largest production floor in the plant, as a big part of the further floors is taken up by the nuclear reactors. I decided to test the production at this stage by connecting all the output belts to sinks and running the plant for a few hours while building the next floor. And it's good that I tested it, because already at this stage I could find several issues that would have caused problems for the plant later. For instance, the AI limiters were not produced at 100% efficiency because the machines were lacking quick wire. Tracking back the issue, I found out that one quick wire belt was not full, which was caused by a miscalculation at distributing the caterium ingots. There was another issue with the AI limiters as well, as some refineries were not getting enough copper seeds. This was caused by an error in directing belts of various sizes to wrong machines. A similar problem was also blocking the production of electromagnetic control rods which were lacking stators. This was caused by the stator production not getting enough steel pipes. I also had by mistake not connected water to one of the refineries for iron ingots, which caused problems further down the line. The second floor of this plant contains the first nuclear reactors. I tested different layouts for 252 reactors, but in the end decided I will use 4 sectors on 2 of the floors that for the most part contain 32 reactors, except one on each floor that only contains 30 reactors. This results in a total of 126 reactors per floor. I decided to make the floors 9 walls tall to have room for particle accelerators later, but even that isn't enough for a nuclear reactor, so I just decided to make the sectors containing them twice as tall. Hopefully I can figure out some nice decorations here as well to use the tall ceilings. As mentioned before, I'm leaving the entrance sector empty to provide some large space to play with when decorating the plant. That leaves just one sector for other machines. I'm manufacturing the encased uranium cells on this floor in 84 manufacturers. For this I'm using the infused uranium cell recipe which takes silica and quick-wire from the previous floor as well as sulfur and uranium from the raw materials. So far I've used long manifolds to bring all the materials in, but for radioactive items I built load balancers instead. As the uranium is in belts of 600 and one belt of 300 uranium per minute, I have a variety of load balancers making sure that it is distributed evenly to machines taking 25 uranium per minute. Sometimes it's simple, and well, sometimes less so. The output encased uranium cells are guided to 7 belts of 240 items per minute, which means the output from 12 manufacturers each. Since I didn't want any radioactive materials in the plant while I build it, the uranium inputs are currently empty. Now that the plant is built, I can practically start it by just feeding some uranium to these manufacturers. I'm also making crystal oscillators on this floor in 30 manufacturers using the insulated crystal oscillator recipe. And finally I'm creating some beacons in 11 manufacturers using the crystal beacon recipe. This plant does use beacons when producing the uranium fuel rods, and while update 6 removes beacons, it doesn't remove alternate recipes using them at least yet. The third floor contains 84 manufacturers that produce the uranium fuel rods for the 252 reactors in this plant, using the uranium fuel unit recipe. This production also uses load balancers for inputs. As each belt for the encased uranium cells has 240 items per minute, and the recipe requires 20 per minute, I built a 12-way load balancer for each belt by first splitting the belt to 3 and then to 2 twice. To simplify the load balancers at the nuclear reactors, I'm gathering the output from just 3 manufacturers, which means there's a total of 28 belts for the uranium fuel rods. Handling the logistics of these in a neat way turned out to be an interesting challenge. I'm also bringing in some iron ingots here to turn into iron plates, which are then brought together with some nitrogen gas and water to 30 blenders that create nitric acid. The uranium waste processing also requires some sulfuric acid, which I'm making in 18 refineries on this floor. The fourth floor contains the remaining nuclear reactors in identical layout as on the second floor. The uranium fuel rods are load balanced to the reactors such that each belt transports 1.8 uranium fuel rods per minute, which is exactly what 9 reactors require. So a 3-way split and a further 3-way split to each of the outputs is the required load balancer. As I mentioned in the previous episode of this series, the water pipes for nuclear reactors already provide exactly 300 water per minute, so distributing the water is simple. Each pipe leads to just one reactor. The logistics provided some good opportunities to practice creating neat pipe layouts. The output uranium waste is carried to belts of 300 waste per minute and a residual belt that will transport 120 waste per minute. The reason for this is that the plutonium pellet takes 25 waste per minute and non-fissile uranium takes 37.5 waste per minute, which work well with 300 waste per minute. Both of these productions are on the 4th floor as well. Non-fissile uranium is produced in 60 blenders, which is 9.6 more than is needed for 252 reactors. I decided to overclock one blender to 140% so that and 49 normal blenders handle the standard non-fissile uranium production. The remaining 10 are on standby handling the overflow of uranium waste in case I mess up something when starting up the plant. As the uranium waste is brought in on 8 belts of 300 waste per minute and a residual belt of 120 waste per minute, and as the blenders should receive 75% of the waste and particle accelerators 25%, I'm sending 6 of the belts of 300 to blenders for non-fissile uranium and 2 belts to particle accelerators for plutonium pellets. I'll talk about the residual belt in a second. As each blender requires 37.5 uranium waste per minute, each waste belt of 300 per minute can support 8 blenders, and so I built a load balancer for 8 machines leading to them. This production also produces some output water that I must, similarly as with the water from aluminium scrap before, sending out of the power plant to be converted to fuel and then burnt. The plutonium pellet production also only needs 25.2 particle accelerators, but I decided to build 30 to have spare capacity. Again, I'm overclocking one accelerator to 120% and sending the nuclear waste to this as well as 24 normal particle accelerators as standard. The overflow is sent to the remaining 5 accelerators if needed. One waste belt of 300 items per minute is enough for 12 particle accelerators, so a 12-way load balancer is required. This means I've covered 24 of the required 25.2 particle accelerators and 48 of the required 50.4 blenders with the standard waste belts. The remaining machines need to be covered by the residual belt of 120 waste per minute. This requires a bit more complicated load balancer. Firstly, 1/4 or 30 per minute of the waste is sent to the overclocked particle accelerator. The remaining 90 per minute is distributed in a load balancer that sends 5/12 of it to the normal blender and 7/12 of it to the overclocked blender. This way the 140% overclocked blender also gets 40% more waste. The remaining 10 blenders for non-fissile uranium and 5 particle accelerators for plutonium pellets are backup. Each of the uranium waste belts contain a smart splitter that sends overflow to a single belt that also has a container where, in case of emergency, additional uranium waste can also be manually stored if needed. After that, there's a load balancer that sends 25% of the waste to the particle accelerators and 75% of it to the blenders. A simple manifold is built for these machines as they shouldn't ever be needed, and if they are, they will only be needed temporarily, as the standard machine should be able to process all the waste this plant produces. The plutonium pellet production also requires non-fissile uranium, 100 of it per minute. Each of the blenders produces 50 per minute, so the load balancer for this part gathers output from 6 blenders and splits it to 3 particle accelerators. The output from one of the blenders as well as the 140% overclocked one is gathered and fed to the 120% overclocked particle accelerators. The output from the backup blenders is simply gathered and sent as a manifold to the backup particle accelerators. And finally we have the 5th and the last floor. First I'm producing some batteries in one 50% underclocked manufacturer. This tiny production is needed for the drones bringing uranium from the impure node in the rocky desert. I'm also creating some heat sinks in 15 assemblers using the heat exchanger recipe. I'm then turning the plutonium pellet manufactured on the previous level as well as some concrete to encased plutonium cells in 90 assemblers. Similarly as before, only 75.6 are needed, but I built some spare capacity which is useful to have if things go wrong. In this case I overclocked 3 assemblers to 120% because that made sense for the load balancer. The output from the plutonium pellet production is gathered to 8 belts of 90 plutonium pellet per minute, as well as to 1 belt containing the output from the overclocked particle accelerator and 1 containing the potential backup production. The standard belts of 90 plutonium pellet per minute are sent to load balancers that distribute them to 9 assemblers each. The belt from the overclocked plutonium pellet production is split 3 ways to the 3 120% overclocked assemblers. And the backup belt is sent to a simple manifold feeding 15 backup assemblers for the encased plutonium cells. Finally, the encased plutonium cells are, together with the heat sinks we just created, steel beams and electromagnetic control rods, turned to plutonium fuel rods. This is done in 60 manufacturers, although as before we only need 15.4 in a normal situation. Now I want to overclock 2 machines to 120% instead of 1 to 140%, because that works better with the 3 120% overclocked machines of the previous production. The output from 12 assemblers for encased plutonium cells is load balanced to 8 manufacturers. This requires 6 belts. In addition, the output from the 120% overclocked assemblers is gathered and split to 2 120% overclocked manufacturers for the plutonium fuel rods. As before, the backup outputs are simply gathered and manifolded to the 10 backup manufacturers for the plutonium fuel rods. As the last step, the output from all the manufacturers for the plutonium fuel rods are gathered on a single belt which is then sent to the awesome sink. And that concludes this massive production chain. This became a bit long video, I hope it wasn't too boring. I wanted to include all the production steps to point out how massive this plant really is. I'll next work on hopefully making the plant look pretty, and then I'll do a series of test runs to see if it actually works. I'm quite certain I will have messed up a few things, especially with the load balancers. Troubleshooting these issues is going to be so much fun. The next video in this series will showcase the finished plant, including some videos of me starting it up. Stay tuned for that, and if you're not a subscriber yet, please consider it. In case you want to see earlier videos on the Max Nuclear Plant project, those can be found on my Mega Factory playlist. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.